New to Legacy, returning after a long break. This is the episode for you.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
I need more stuff. Can't see, I need more stuff. And now it goes. I'm keeping up with the Joneses.
Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Bro, it's going great. We have a very special guest on the cast today.
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce Aaron Gibbons, who
Welcome.
is a longtime Magic player, returning after a long break, and we're going to learn about his experience and what outlets he used to get back into this game after all of the overhaul that's happened. I'm going to let Aaron introduce himself in a moment, but to give you a rundown, he never experienced Ragavan, didn't experience Ren and 6, didn't experience Oko, didn't experience Dreadhorde Arcanist. All of these things that have overhauled our lives, he wasn't around for, and now he's back in. How do you do it? Aaron, take it away.
Yeah, name's Aaron. Got into Legacy probably, seven, 8 years ago. Got into it with Death and Taxes, and first off, all those cards you said, I don't know what they do. So
This is
Let's
great,
not
'cause
be.
we can approach
Blessings
this-
on your house.
We can approach this from a I've never played Legacy stance
Yeah.
too, if you're watching. Yeah.
So just kind of got into the format however I could, and I just found that I had played Standard, I had played Commander, I had played Modern, but then there was just this new level of every single phase of a turn matters because there's so much interaction, and the stack got so much bigger than I'd ever seen in any other format, and I was hooked. So started learning all the little dirtly things you could do with D&T, tried out blade lists, ended up falling in love with control, played a lot of control. Coming back to Magic, I left initially because I was just super hyper focused on work. We were launching our own business and brand. It just took a lot of focus, and I couldn't really have time. I didn't have time to travel or do anything for Magic, so I just set it to the side. Came back to it just because, a little bit of time opened up, job shift, and then I just enjoy the game still. The game, it seems like whenever you get into it, the game is still just as good.
Well, that's the one beautiful thing about Magic
Yeah.
is it'll still be there for you when you're ready to come back.
Mhm.
Aaron, did you hang on to your collection even while you were taking a break?
I hung on to a majority of it, not all of it. I hung on to the dual lands, obviously, and that's about it. A handful of other things, but
A fun fact that you and I overlap in a unique way in our quest to becoming control bros is you were a Thalia gamer, and when I first started, I was casting Aether Vial with Merfolk, and then tried LED as a Storm guy, and none of that worked, and so I started casting Entreat the Angels. So to give everybody some context as to how Aaron and I met, he just reached out on Discord. He was like, "Hey man, can you talk to me about some control lists that I'm like sort of tinkering with?" And we hopped on a call. He told me how he had just gotten back into the game, and so to that extent, we started talking. And then we were like, "Oh, I was like, oh, your experience of getting back into the game could be useful for like a ton of other players, particularly for other players that like are currently actively playing but aren't necessarily playing Legacy as a means to get into the game." So beyond just asking a diehard Miracles bro on Discord to chat, were there any other resources that you used to like get back into the game to get acclimated with Legacy again?
We should take this moment also to point out that you should go to our Discord and join it. The link is below. It's a great way to meet other people playing Legacy.
yeah, I agree. I mean, community's huge. So reaching out to a handful of the people that I knew that still played and like, hey, you guys still playing? What's going on? Obviously, type in MTG top 8. I'm like, what do decks even look like right now?
Yeah.
Leaving, Miracles was still prevalent. There was a lot of Miracles control lists. It wasn't the most popular control, but it was still pretty popular. Anurag was Miracles diehard. Popped onto one of his streams and saw him playing some 4-color stuff, and I started like skipping through all of the old videos. I'm like, okay, well, where's the Miracles? And it just didn't exist. I was like, oh, well, that's weird. Like this guy's diehard Miracles player. So I started digging through, and Miracles didn't seem to exist. And then found some really cool Miracles cards. I actually I typed in Miracles Legacy on YouTube. 90s MTG popped up, and it's where I discovered 40K Force Phil. So
that labeling. So Chris Benucci, who hosts 90s MTG, he
Yeah.
labels whenever I play, I'm playing with Triumph of St. Catherine, which is the new miracle card from the 40K Warhammer decks in the Commander product, and so he labels the deck 40K Miracles. But then I have people, because my deck is fully altered, I have people go, Phil, is it called 40K Miracles because it's worth 40K? And I'm like,
I
not
thought
quite.
That's actually what I thought until just now.
Yeah, I was just like totally just like look how much value is in this list. No, it's 40K because it's referencing Warhammer, but I found that it was confusing for people coming to it for the first time.
In the grim darkness of the future, there are only 40K Magic decks, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, coming back, I wasn't as familiar with Warhammer. So when I saw Triumph, I wasn't aware that they'd even merged all different universes into the Magic universe, with like Walking Dead cards. All of a sudden, I walked by the shelf. I first caught my eye was I was walking by looking in the case at the local shop when I finally came in, and there was a Godzilla card. And I was, and there's a Post Malone card. I was just like, wow, this is crazy. What all this changed so quickly that now all these universes starting to come in. Now the Lord of the Rings set coming out, and very exciting cards in there, for control players and other people as well. But yeah, so I started looking at lists. Initially tried to play very standard control that I was used to. And as I was talking with Phil, there has been a power creep that I was not used to. And there's cards like Urza's Saga that on their own just win the game if they're played and you don't deal with them. So I had to adjust the way you play control. Struggled for the first 3 weeks. From being like, whenever I used to go to my local, I felt very confident always being at the top tables or close to, top 8 pretty much every time. I felt pretty comfortable to not even feeling like I could win a game. Not knowing what's out there. There's some card out there. There's a bunch of ones that do it, but they give you initiative and learning what initiative is. And I was like, this is insane. And it just keeps repeating. So really, really cool mechanics to come back to and try to figure out. And yeah.
So it was a combination of your own research, looking up lists, and is that what is that more or less? Was it just like a given amount of effort to like learn what the cards in the decks that were showing up in those top 8 lists look like, and then thinking about how you would approach a control deck towards them, or did you look at the stock control lists, pilot them, recognize why those cards were there, and do it that way? Were you more in theory based, or were you more in trial and error to get back in?
I'd say a healthy mix of both. I didn't have a lot of people to play with, so a lot of it was theory to start. I was looking at control lists, and playing control is such a different archetype, I find, than like when I played tempo or I played, mid-rangey decks or even combo decks. You have a pretty laid out game plan of what you're trying to do, and you play the deck. Whereas control has a difference is you play the meta. And so I struggled a lot because, one, to play control well, you need to know what the meta looks like, what cards even exist, what cards am I fighting over, what cards am I allowing to resolve, things like that. And because your resources are also limited, and you have to make sure you're using them on the highest value targets, right? And getting card advantage. So coming back, it was a lot of, okay, well, what cards are in what decks are primarily showing up on the top 8 versus tabletop and online, because those are two very different metas. And then trying to understand why people were running certain cards. Like I had talked with you, that one list I came across, that staff Urza's list, where I was like, why is Triumph in the sideboard? Like, if you're going to run it, why aren't you just running it? And having that talk with you and being like, well, it's really not great in a lot of matchups, but when it's good, it's good. And it's like, this is where you bring it in. And it started, okay, well, that makes more sense, because as a former I didn't get to play Miracles with Top, though, so I will say that I'm not that experienced with Top or anything. But the Miracles list I was playing, you were committed to the Miracle strategy. There was Terminus and typically entreat or something in the main board, and that was your strategy. You're running portents, predicts, accumulated knowledges, and things like that when I was stepping out. So trying to adjust and learn how to play Legacy again was a mix, I would say, definitely of like talking to friends, getting in and just throwing myself in there and figuring out what worked, didn't work, approaching every loss humbly and being like, hey, you know, okay, I lost, but this is how I boarded. What does your deck even do? Do you mind showing me? You know, and you know what? The one thing I found, especially about the Legacy community, is everyone is so excited about their deck that they play that they are just so willing to go, look at this cool new card that's in here, and this does this, and this does that. So just sitting there and after a match, and let's say you lose a real quick 0-2, you lose, just say like talking with them and saying, hey, you know, like, what does your deck do? And then if you were playing my deck, how would you board? And just like laying out your deck and showing them, and they're like, oh, and people are always so willing to help you get back into it. You know, just reaching out like I did online. There's so many communities, and especially in Legacy, it's very tight knit, and people are just so willing to sit there, talk with you. If you don't even know what questions to ask, just looking like, look, I looked at this. I don't understand why someone's running this in their deck. It doesn't look good to me. Why is it there? There's an expert at every single archetype in Legacy that you can find and talk to, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I think you touched on a really important, like just overall lesson of Magic the Gathering, but a really great lesson in Legacy. To quote the Dalai Lama, when you lose, don't lose the lesson. And I think those last like 5 minutes after you end a match and you're done the game, getting that discussion in with your opponent is often more important than playing the match.
Yeah, I very much so agree.
I think that there's something to be said about, particularly when you're learning an archetype or learning a deck or trying to get more reps, to the value that you get off of those reps, where actually approaching the games, even if you're mid-game, if you don't know how to approach a certain moment or anything like that, even just like jotting a note down on the side to ask afterwards, more often than not, your opponents will be happy to talk about those situations, because if you're thinking about it, they're probably also thinking about it too. And if they're more experienced, they might be able to relay some information. A lot of the ways that I figured out which sideboard cards I want as another control mage against certain archetypes is when I lose to an opponent that is crushing me against a certain list, I'll ask, what are the cards you are afraid of? Like, what are the things that you don't want to see across the board that give you trouble? And in what positions are those cards most leveraged against you? And they'll usually share, you know, like it's the same thing. If anybody were to ask me, like people all the time will say, I tried this out or I boarded this, they'll explain to me what they did. I remember I had a conversation this past week. I was playing against a guy who plays Delver pretty routinely. And I was on, you know, my 40K list, and, you know, 5/5 Bane Slayers are just crazy good in that matchup. If you don't have any specific targeted answers for a 5/5 lifelinker, it's probably going to, you know, end the game by itself. But when he was showing me, he boarded out like one card here, one card here. He sort of like just shaved his numbers. And I remember thinking, for the longest time, I was always thinking, every time my opponent plays a wasteland, if it's not backed by damage, you know, if that wastelanding me isn't trading for a turn that they're converting damage, that wasteland is a wasted slot in my view. It's a card that's not worth anything if it's not converting time in the matchup. And so I remember thinking, if I were playing Delver against me, and you know, he was playing a new version with the dragons, the Tarkir battle card. Yeah. So every version is going to have, you know, different nuances. But for the most part, if you're playing stock Delver, if I was playing stock Delver against, you know, a generic Jeskai control list, I would drop my wastelands, go from 18 lands to 14 lands to board in like all my Pyroblasts and just be this insanely threat dense deck, knowing that my mana is never going to be under duress, because the axis that the control decks don't play on is fighting over mana. And even if they have something like Ruination or something like that in the board, they're not bringing it in against Delver, because that's not the plan. That's not how you beat Delver. So if I were playing against me and as a Delver pilot, I would just cut the wastelands. But that wasn't necessarily something that crossed his mind. Maybe you cut a wasteland or two, but never to drop all the way down to 14 lands and just be this efficient, optimized, like very densely packed action machine. And granted, I don't know if that's the correct strategy, But every time I was saying, like, I never fear when you play the first wasteland if it's not backed by a threat, or if you don't have a heavy wasteland draw to line up with my non-basic draw. Like, and those are variables that aren't necessarily in your control. And so leveraging that sort of, but like that's the sort of information that you would gain by just asking your opponent after the game if you can remember, like, I don't know how to board. And so your take of, approaching the game with a mindset to learn rather than a mindset to win when you're first getting back in is, I think, one of the most important takeaways, rather.
Yeah. I think there was a recent episode of Eternal Glory where they talked about this having like a learner's mindset. It was actually specifically about getting into Legacy, and they were talking about having a learner's mindset and being honest with yourself about why you lost, and also if you're not able to figure out why you lost, is like checking in on your opponent and saying like, hey, how'd this happen? And even if you didn't lose, like, still it's fine to ask these questions and be like, hey, like, when we were fighting over whatever it was, why did you do this or whatnot? What was going on in your mind? Because it just helps you to get into the mind of the opponent a lot better too.
Dude, I don't know, Aaron, you'll tell me if you have anybody at the shop, because I want to ask about the people that you were with when you got back in. But this like, even when you're been playing Control for years, having never taken a break, I've been playing Control consistently for a decade, and to this day, I try to maintain a learner's mindset as best I possibly can. This past week at the shop, I had my buddy Andrew sitting next to me while I was playing not a Control mirror, but I was playing against 5-color Yorion Zenith, and Andrew can see my hand and all the decisions that I'm making with what cards I'm putting back off Brainstorm, et cetera, et cetera. And there was one moment where I recognized at some point in the game, I was like, oh, that was the moment that I think I punted this game away. Had I just not fetched at this particular time, I think I would have at least had the tools to deal with the thing that I ultimately died to. And I should have been able to recognize that. And I turned to Andrew the second that I recognized that moment. I turned to him and I go, you're thinking of the same moment I'm thinking of that I punted this game, right? And he was like, yeah, I think so. And then afterwards we talked about it. And, it's like, it was one of those things where I believed I thought I recognized the situation. But I turned to somebody who's also watching that I respect as a player and said, am I right? Do you think that this is correct? My analysis of where I went wrong. And knowing that was right, it reinforced like, okay, yes, I think I recognize, I'm recognizing my spots. It's good. Like my craft is still there, if you know what I mean. So yeah. When you were getting back in and talking to friends, did your friends, were they the same people that were playing as when you took a break?
So I recognize some of the faces, but so when I primarily played a lot, I was traveling around with the same group of guys, and we were in Orange County, Temecula, and Los Angeles area. Just kind of all over Southern California. And I had just barely tapped into the scene down in San Diego and started playing for maybe about three months. So I recognized some of the faces, but I hadn't made connections with them really. But it was enough to where I was able to chit chat with a few of them and kind of get an idea of like what's going on. I kept asking people, I'm like, who's the control player in the room that you guys all worry about? And no one, there was one guy that they're like, he's okay. So that's when I started reaching out to you.
What's that line? If you don't know who the control player is, it's you.
Yeah, that's very true.
If you don't know who the sucker in the room is, you're the sucker.
There's a handful of control players down there. There's another great guy, Mike Byrne. He's been chatting with me about different lists and different ideas. So there's other guys that I think we're searching for how to play control. But one of the things, I love you're sitting there talking about asking those questions, but being conscious of not deciding whether something was good or bad based on outcome. Looking that one's huge because, like, for instance, I sat there and I could talk about a play the other night where there was my opponent mulled to 5, played one land. I was on the play. I play my land. He plays his land, passes, and then I play my land. He doesn't play a land and plays Ponder. And so I went to misstep it, and then he forced it, and I forced it back because I was under the thought of, hey,
it's that important.
He doesn't have any land. He's fighting. He's trying to find land right now. Maybe it's a got you. But in reality, I sat there and I talked through it with my other friend. He's like, your mental misstep was a him to Turok. And then when you forced back, you left it to variance of whether he got to him you back. So just because he didn't draw the land off the top is like, that was variance. It wasn't necessarily a good play. Even though it paid off in my favor, he didn't draw a land for 3 turns, and I ran away with the game at that point. But just being able to sit there and talk through, like, hey, yes, this play worked out for you, or it didn't work out for you, but is it a good play? Is it the correct percentage play to be making in these situations? And that's how you get better as a player. You start seeing patterns like that, and you're like, okay, well, I don't know what I'm necessarily doing, but I know that this is probably the correct play in this matchup. And then, asking, at the end of the matchup, just like you're saying, taking notes on the side, like, I don't know what this card does. I don't really know how it interacts. I don't know how this interacts with the stack if I do this. And just constantly trying to learn what the new cards that you're seeing do.
Yeah. So you in this scenario, he was playing Delver, I'm assuming.
I don't know what he was playing. Actually, to this day, I don't know what he's playing. He didn't get to play.
Oh, that's fair, because he didn't get to play it. Whenever that happens against Delver, when they're looking for a land like that, and I I get that like him to Torak effect, I kind of let it slide after that, specifically because if they're not tempoing me out, I'm probably winning, right? Like, Delver, all those counter spells are just there to protect the queen in Delver. So like when you're getting that value of like, oh, I just made him drop like what is essentially a time walk and some other card, right? If you can do that enough times against Delver, you just win because they run out of cards.
100%. It's on the flip side of it, let's say he does land that one land. I had lost multiple games now and throughout playing Legacy and learning Legacy, to one Delver flipped, and I couldn't fight back, because I fought over a cantrip, or I fought over something that just didn't matter. So if they're willing to fight over their cantrip, that's one less way they can fight over protecting what actually matters.
Exactly.
So being able to identify what matters in a deck too. So another great question to sit there and ask someone, what do you think is like the biggest threats in your deck? What cards are you looking for in the matchup? Not even like what he brought it up. Phil brought up a great thing of, what do you fear on my end? But also it's like, what are you looking for when you're sitting there and you cast that cantrip, or when you cast that Green Sun Zenith? What were you looking for that you knew was going to stump me, so that I know what to look out for and how to better board for it?
Yeah, and if you countered that Green Sun Zenith, did it matter?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, are you throwing out stuff just to see if I have anything, just to see if I'll counter it? Like a Storm player just throwing out a Dark Ritual just to see what you do, when they're low on mana. So a lot of Legacy, I think, is learned over time, and if you're patient and you have an open mind to it, I think it is easily one of the greatest formats to play. There's so much variance. When new cards come out, regardless of what type it is, whether it's a commander card, whatever it is, you can potentially play with it. And I think the variance that you see, and I love Brewers. Sometimes it's a little memey, but sometimes you see some cards like, I don't know if I would ever run that. But the fact that you can is awesome. I like it.
Yeah, I have an appreciation for other brewers, even if they're way off the deep end on their brews, because usually if a brewer is a good player, right? You're like, oh, this good player that I know is brewing a deck. Why are they doing that? Even if they're just looking to spice things up a little bit. Usually when they're brewing to attack something, and so unless they have like a zany idea, if they're not just doing it for kicks. I'll ask, like, what is this trying to target? And if they're going after like certain top players in the metagame, it's actually interesting to see other people's ideas of how you're supposed to attack those decks. Not every player is going to be different. Like if you're coming into Legacy and you're like, I'm a combo player, I'm always casting LED. The way that you're going to want to like learn the format or learn getting back into Legacy to combat what you expect to face across the table is very different from a control mage getting back into the game. Like the way that we assess games is very different. And so finding the people that also have experience with those archetypes is, I think, the fastest way to skip all of the work that those people have already done already.
100%.
Like you can go through and do all of this like work yourself of like learning all the things. But if you ask somebody, hey, have you tested this? Have you tested this? I'm trying this idea against this deck that I keep losing against. What do you think of that? If somebody's like, dude, I tried it for like 3 months and could not make it work. The follow-up to that is, okay, how are you implementing it? And then if that's the way that you would have implemented it and it still didn't work, then suffice to say, you're probably safe not having to take the time to do so. But if they implemented it differently than you thought you would, ask them why they did that, and then you actually can learn where that mindset is and develop together. More brains is usually better than trying to go at it alone. And I found that when you were talking to me about why staff, here's what I would like to do, and the control decks that you were like, I'm looking at this, I want to play it like this. And then as we were talking, like, because right now in the control world, Zach, it might be different in the ACAST world. In the control world, there's like the staff control lists, then there's like the Planeswalker Days Undoing control lists, then there's the like Fairy Mastermind Flash control lists. There's like generic like dudes like me that can't let go of counterbalance. Like there's a lot of different variations of control. Usually there's the 4-color control list with Minsk and Boo. There's the 5-color Yorion control lists, like that are all essentially base blue-white control decks with all of these other tools. And all of those other tools are meant to combat different parts of the format, but how you navigate with those decks and against those decks is different based on which one you're piloting. And like it's possible that the misstepping the ponder and fighting over it is potentially valuable if you're in like the Jeskai control deck with all the Planeswalkers, because you know you're going to be tapping out for the next 2 or 3 turns. And so that misstep is never going to be live. Where if you're in like the Flash staff control deck, you're leaving up mana every turn for staff anyway. And if you can disguise your stuff, so like those decisions are always going to be nuanced from game to game, but knowing not only how to assess those positions, but how to assess those positions with the kind of list that you're running and how those play patterns operate are also really, really valuable. I get that it's like a little bit more leveled up once you're back into it, but I have found that when I am requesting the same way for help from players that I find that I believe are better than I am, and I'm asking for advice from them, I'm approaching it through the lens of like, what is the control shell that they have been playing, and what's the play patterns that they believe are the correct ones, and that's how I would approach it. So like when we were talking about the staff list, Staff Urza Saga, that's a Marcus innovation, and so we were all in a chat talking to Marcus about like, hey man, you've been crushing these leagues, you've been running hot in the challenges. What is the approach to this list? Why these card choices? And I saw that those kinds of card choices then translated to other control mages. So like Mark Vogt, who's been dominating in Europe playing a 4-color control list, but he was also on staff. And I noticed he was also dropping prismatic endings to play Spell Pierce. And I was like, what is going on? Why are we cutting prismatic ending? We're just like, are we just deciding that we're going to lose the chalice? Is that what's going on? Like, what is the rationale here? And then once I saw that the pattern between all of these guys was we want to be able to disguise ourselves under a staff. And they're playing to leverage the fact that they have Staff of the Storyteller to run away with the game. And as long as they continue to leverage their mana in that way to either draw cards or interact and never waste anything, they'll come out ahead because their deck is built upon engines. So all that is to say, when reaching out and learning and requesting from people who have more experience in the game, coming at it with like very precise, like what is it that you want to learn? Like what do you want to know beyond what card choices, what style of deck? Like, okay, what card choices and why? How do I implement them? How do I use them? Like not only knowing like, oh, these are the best cards, this is why they're in the sideboard, is also knowing like, yeah, fire off the meltdown against 8-cast when it catches this thing. Like make sure that this gets swept up as part of it. Otherwise, you're probably firing it off too soon or something like that. Like actually know in the games where you will be able to assess patterns. But so sorry, going back to the people that you recognize, is now that you've come back into the game, is there like a group of people that now you sort of analyze games, card choices with, things of that nature that you've gotten back in?
I'm working on that still. I don't really have a community down here yet that I can talk about card choices or anything like that yet, but I'm also been pretty busy with work, so I haven't been actively seeking it.
I'm still on that path too, where I've just started to reach out to the like local scene here, and there's a play group that meets every Thursday, so I'm starting to get involved with that, and it takes time. It just takes
Yeah.
it takes a little while, especially if you move or whatnot, like that. Just it becomes a whole thing where you have to like be an adult that has to make new friends, which is always hard.
Yeah. And
Well,
the
also,
beauty, go ahead.
I was given that we're on a podcast, was there any resources outside of people directly that you like? Were there any resources that you listened to or looked into to learn more about getting back in or anything of that nature like beyond YouTube?
Beyond YouTube would it just be probably MTG Top 8, MTG Goldfish, stuff like that I'm just like looking up, okay, well, this is a card I like. All right. Can I build a deck around it? What other decks are doing well with this card? Okay. And they're running these cards. And then I have two screens and I sit there and I pull up 3 or 4 lists and I just look at them. I'm like, well, what's the subtle difference? Okay, well, this guy's running this and where are they making changes in variance? I'm a spreadsheet guy too. So I love my spreadsheets. So I'll sit there and I'll put down cards. I'm like, all right, well, this card popped up in MTG Top 8 multiple times, this times, and this card top 8's X amount of times, whatever percentages. And I'll sit there and just lay out all these cards. I'm like, okay, well, these cards seem to actually be good and they're not just hyped. So right now, one of them that I think is like kind of like you're on either side of the coin, whether it's good or not, is Staff. And I will say in my experience that every time I have landed Staff and it has stuck around, it has just been an insane value engine. And people, if they don't answer it, even if they kill my flyer that it makes me, it's insane. So as long as you can feed it, it will pay off. So especially when you start talking about the miracles options, you talked about a play about setting up your miracle to be on when you can activate it on their turn, so you can get the triumph out. Got to do that last night. It was great. It was my first decent performance. Yeah, I went 3-1, but it was lost to elves. But
I mean, that'll happen.
Yeah,
Allosaur Shepherd, man, Allosaur Shepherd.
That
card didn't exist when you took a break.
No, he had 2 of them out there, and I was like, oh, I should have brought in Pithing Needle so he can't activate it. Because I have the Urza as well. Oh. So it's like there's just things that I didn't think about. You don't think about. You're like, oh, I don't really know what's happening, and then as you lose to it, like you said, learning from it, sitting down, talking with people again, huge.
But yeah, and that's a point where like when somebody plays Staff Control and asks you, hey Aaron, how do I play against elves? You can be like, it will sound weird, but board in Pithing Needle to name Allosaur Shepherd. Right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of nuance is so valuable because nobody approaching the elves matchup is going, well, obviously I want Pithing Needle. Yeah. But it has like actually a lot of high value targets between Allosaur Shepherd and Wirewood Symbiote. Like there's a lot of tact there.
There is a lot. Quirion Ranger. There's a lot that you can do with it, and you don't really need the Soul Lantern because they don't really interact with their graveyard a whole lot. So it's just, I think, you guys at the Legacy community, Magic community in general, people like their thing that they do. And so it's like, find the people that do what it is and play the game the way you want to play the game. And the day and age, like the beauty of it is you're on the opposite end of the country and I'm able to sit down and chat with you and talk about Magic. So it's just about reaching out to people and talking to them. If you can't find the people immediately in your local community that you can sit there and mesh with, that usually takes a bit of time because people have their people that they see, and if you're just
you're the new guy, it's like, why am I talking to you?
It takes time. It's going to take they're like, okay, it's another person that's going to be here for 2 weeks and then we'll never see again. So
no new friends.
As you show up and you sit there and casually talk to them, get to remember people's names, like, oh hey man, how'd you do? And talking about their matches, let them tell you about their matches, just kind of just be as greeting as possible as you can with these people, and it helps integrate you into the community. And in no time they'll be like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? They'll start talking about their decks with you, and then you guys can sit there and, oh, you guys ever like play test during the week? You guys ever like go sit down or come over for a barbecue, whatever, and we can play some Magic? It just takes time when it's local, I think. And what we can do is, I reached out and to Phil and a bunch of other control players, and within a couple days we were sitting there setting up times to talk, so we have access around the entire world to talk to different Magic players. And What's interesting too is also looking at foreign metas and how they build your deck. I remember looking at a lot of Japanese lists that they're always so much different. They always have these cards. I'm like, why is this in the deck? Like this makes no sense. And so just looking at different stuff, because once you start looking at MTG Top 8 and you see, for instance, back like Grixis Delver when I played that a little bit, the Grixis Delver list really didn't change. But all of a sudden you'd go see and you look at this Japanese list and you're like, wow, why is this in the deck? This is completely different. They're running more true names. Why is that? Whatever. And so just trying to get different viewpoints on how to run your deck, and then like you said, just running through the questions of why and always asking why, not having someone like, oh well, what do you think about this card, and like, no, it sucks, and that's all they say.
Yeah, no,
that's not,
those are the worst
feedback.
Reddit comments ever. It's like, no, this is bad. It's like, then tell me why. Yeah,
if I sat there and you asked me for a book, like, hey, I'm looking for a book for self-improvement, what do you recommend? I recommend a book to you, and you're like, okay, thanks. That does no good to you. It's like, you're like, that's a great book. I'm going to go check that out. No, what you do is you're like, okay, well, why did you like that book? What did you take from the book? What specific thing about that book do you use in your life today? Things like that. So, and the same thing happens with Magic. So, well, why did you choose this card? And how has it benefited you? How do you deal with this matchup? Like I brought up to Phil, he's like, oh, I just don't board for that matchup at all. I just hope to dodge it. And I was like, well, that's a valid thing, if that's, and tracking what did you go against. You go in your local meta, and I write down every deck that I go against, and I'm like, okay, well, I've gone against this many times, so this is probably what I'm going to see mostly. If I see elves, it is what it is. So it's,
well, on the topic of resources, like Twitter's a great resource, Zoom obviously a great resource, Spell Table, you can play people that way. Moxfield is a great resource, and we're sponsored by Moxfield. As far as like, building your deck, and you can follow different people on there that are building decks. Like Phil has his miracles list on there that he shares constantly, and that's a great resource because it's a great place to just build your deck and kind of show it off and show the changes that you've made on it.
And it's also that's a resource where a lot of people that have asked, hey Phil, what are you trying? Why are you trying it? Those sorts of things. I'll always give them my Moxfield, because then they can also see the changes that I make and when I make them. And then if something throws them off, if they've spoken to me before, they can just be like, I saw that you made this change. Why did you do that? So it like speeds up the process from having to like wait for another deck list dump or, from MTG Top 8 when they actually do the like get submissions from deck lists. So like this past weekend, no, 2 weekends ago, past weekend, maybe, I forget. But I top 8'd a 1K, and I played a 1/1 Force of Will split. I literally cut some Force of Wills out of my deck, and I got some questions like, Phil, why are you cutting forces? And it was because I was experimenting. I was legit like, I didn't know if it was correct to do in the list that I was playing, but I was experimenting because I was on 4 counterbalance, and I found that with Triumph, having 4 Triumph and 4 Force of Will meant that my 5-drop slot was way too steep. And I wanted to cut it down on counterbalance, so I swapped to a couple of spell pierces and things like that to offset the balance. But like, if you didn't know that going in, you'd just be like, "Oh, Phil's an idiot. He's cutting force." Well, you can't do that, know. So it's like if you see a list or if you see card choices, and Moxfield is a great place to do it. That like approaching everybody's choice. If I see a deck list and I think it's weird and I don't know what's going on and it's a control list and I'm interested, I won't assume that they're doing something wrong. I'll assume that they have thought through why they're making the choice, and then I'll want to understand the thought process. And that is so much more informative, both of like from where they're approaching how they're doing stuff, but also like how you can then look at things, And that was caught when I saw the prismatic ending was cut for Spell Pierce, and I was like, what is going on? Why are they doing that? I imagine this is how you and I, Aaron, feel every time we look at a Japanese list. What is going on? Why are they doing this? And it's like the stuff like on paper, I'm like, this looks strange to me. It's like almost unpalatable. Like it feels weird to look at it and be like, something is amiss. And the idea, I've never been able to speak to a Japanese player, but like to be like, why are you playing 1K command? Why? What is going on? Why is this happening? That's useful. And I found that Moxfield has sort of like expedited that process pretty significantly.
Yeah, you showed me. You actually shared your Moxfield when we sat there and talked about it. And I didn't think anything of it because I just thought it was another site that you just track your deck list. But about 2 days ago, I actually looked into Moxfield and I'm starting to explore it. But it seems like a pretty awesome resource.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I grew up with the guys that made the site, and then we just started using it as our go-to deck list thing. And the more we used it, the more we were like, look at all these features that this has that like other redacted deck site doesn't have, and it just like Phil said, it sort of just expedites the process when you're when you're building a deck, but then two, being able to show your changes, to write a primer about this stuff as well. Like there's so many features that like I barely even have scraped. You said you play Commander. There's this feature on there called packages. And like, let's say you always are going to run the same Sultai lands, and a new Sultai commander comes out. You can just go to your Sultai lands package, drop it in. That's wild. Like it's just something that's been there for a long time that I just found out about. Like, and that's a like really cool feature. If Phil wanted to make another Miracles deck, he could just be like Miracles lands package, bam, or like Miracles cantrip package, bam.
Yeah, it's super nice because typically with the lands, like when you're changing a deck, you'll make a couple subtle changes to it, but being able to just rip and pull the entire lands is just time saving.
Like I've never not played the same 18 lands in Rug Delver. Like it's the same, it's the exact same 18 lands every time. Rug Delver package, bam, and then you create the rest of the deck. Even if you have like there's decks like that only have like 6 flex slots, and you're like, okay, well this is my new version of this deck, and you could be like, that is a package. Now I'll add the 6 cards. It's an interesting feature that the other deck sites don't really have or haven't really explored.
Yeah, one thing that I've found is particularly useful. I mean, I get that like that was part of the sponsorship content, but like aside from that, one thing that like genuinely I didn't expect when using Moxfield compared to anything else. I mean, now that I use Moxfield more, is that if there are players that you are always interested in their lists, right? Like I'm always looking at the European guys' control lists because they always do well. And I want to be able to like, to be able to see like where they are evolving their lists. Like people who keep their lists up to date, you like sort of see their process as they're going through it. You like see changes that they're making. If you just like routinely check in on their list and be like, oh, I don't remember seeing this before. Like what's going on with that, or particular swaps. And if they don't have certain things that you're like, oh, I really, really want this card. Like they don't have the meltdown in the board. And I feel like I'm just naked to 8 cast without it. What are they doing without that? Like those sorts of like interesting insights are only spurred because you're able to look at a deck list in real time,
Yeah.
And like, I try to keep my Miracles list up to date as much, because if anybody ever follows it and is like curious as to know where anything's going, they can actually see in real time every time right before they go to an event or they're like sleeving up cards. They can say, okay, what's going on here? Why is he doing that? And one example recently was I moved away from red, which gives me Power Blast and Meltdown and all those good sideboard cards, because I wanted to be able to play a cleaner mana base. I didn't like being exposed so heavily all the time to Wasteland. But by I moved away from red, and therefore I moved away from Prismatic Ending and towards March of Otherworldly Light. And although I don't necessarily think March is better than Prismatic Ending in certain situations that those sideboard cards were making up a lot of points for. So by being a Triumph list, I'm a 4X Triumph list, which means that I already feel like I'm pre-boarded for Delver because Triumph is insane. And so I was like, okay, I think I can give up some points against Delver because I already feel like I have this giant pre-boarded Haymaker. And I feel like I'm soft to Urza Saga. So by moving over to March of Otherworldly Light, I have something that can catch the Urza Saga in spots where, like, that can still catch Chalice as well. So I gain a little bit of edge against Urza Saga by playing March, and I lose a little bit of edge against Delver by not being able to trade at mana parity with a Prismatic Ending. But like those sorts of shifts, like March of Otherworldly Light makes me feel like I'm good enough against Urza Saga that I don't necessarily need the Meltdown. And those kinds of card choices implying, okay, then what are you soft to? I have found that Moxfield has helped me isolate those positions with other control mages to then be able to hash that stuff out.
Mm-hmm. Also,
and that ends our sponsored segment.
Yeah.
Also, just being able to play it at instant speed, like especially against those tempo decks, sometimes the fact that you're playing on their turn disrupts their pace so much. You may not even get it. They may daze it, they may counter it, but because they weren't able to put down that second threat, it gives you enough time to build up your land base and actually start fighting over stuff that previously you wouldn't have been able to because you had to do it at sorcery speed, and they were allowed to play their game at their way. So.
Yeah.
So when you came back from your break and you got back in and you recognized what all these new cards did, which were the cards that were the most jarring when you read them versus when you played them? And then did that inform how you approached, how you thought the game coming back to the game would be like? Because you obviously had a memory of like what you played and what the format was like when you left. And then coming back, how much of your expectations, if any, were disrupted by these new powerful effects?
So what brought me back initially was how excited I was to play a Days Undoing control deck. I was like, this is so cool. This is going to be amazing. It's so broken. Da 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 da. And I still think it's good. I'm still trying to figure out how to play it properly, but it's but then I looked at cards like Urza's Saga and I was like, I mean, this doesn't do anything. And
this is how I thought Urza Saga worked when I
everyone's like sitting, I was looking at it, I was like, man, everyone's running this Urza Saga. I was like, yeah, it makes an artifact, whatever, not a big deal. I'll plow it. And I just disregarded the card entirely. I didn't even read the whole card. I just looked at it at the beginning. I was like, it's just it is what it is.
We have that video on why Urza Saga is good up here. Like you can go find it.
Something to be said. So you honestly, your assessment wasn't too far off from everybody else when Modern Horizons 2 came out.
Yeah,
everybody was so high on things like Dragon Rage Channeler and Renin 6 and Ragavan and like the just straightforwardly busted stuff that like Urza Saga was more like it came to fruition pretty quickly, but it like when it was spoiled, it was like maybe it's good. Maybe nobody was like,
why do I want an enchantment?
Zero people recognized like this is a pillar of Legacy now immediately. You know.
Yeah, and I was looking at other stuff like Initiative. Same thing. Like it was one of those things that like I saw it going on, but I didn't know what it did. I didn't understand what people were moving the dice on the table because usually I'd be working and I just have something up on YouTube playing on the side, usually 90s. And I'm like, oh, this person has initiative, and they start doing stuff. And I was like, okay, initiative is something. I got to figure out what that does later.
You're like, oh, his opponent's at 5. Why is that?
I was like, I don't know what's going on, but you know, there's a bunch of new stuff I had to learn. And so as I saw, also just I can't emphasize the power creep enough, because before you just had so much time to play your game as a control player. I feel like you could play this like my turn, your turn, my turn, and just swap back and forth and just slowly grind people out. But now there's stuff that there's so many things that just have to be answered. And if you don't answer them in an ample amount of time, the game's done. Initiative being one of them. If you don't get that initiative back, it changes your lines of play so much where, for instance, I went against a Stoneforge player, played a Stoneforge Mystic and grabbed this torch thing that gives you initiative. It's a torch equipment. I forget the name.
Trailblazer torch or something.
Trailblazer.
Yeah, and I was sitting there. I was like, okay, well, I have a staff out with a flyer if I play it, and then that's probably not enough because he's probably sitting on plow. I have removal for his creature, but he has Caracas to bounce his Thalia, and I'm sitting there just lurking this. I was like, how do I get an initiative back? And all of a sudden, now that I know what initiative is, your entire play pattern changed. You're like, all right, I need to play this and the Urza Saga this turn instead of getting more colored mana to do other things. Because if I don't put out a creature before he starts getting too deep into initiative, then I'm never going to catch up. And whereas, you know, like let's say someone had Monarch before or something, like, all right, that's fine, you're doing this stuff, but I'll get it back when it's convenient for me. As long as it doesn't run too long, you know. And you know, Urza Saga 2, just I can't talk about how good that card It's like I thought the card was so mediocre, and the amount of games, and until I played with it and saw like what it was capable of, and all of a sudden being able to pull Pithing Needle out of your board and just search it up, pull the Soul Lantern out immediately, and they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, well, the number of times
just...
that I had to explain to somebody like this is 2 Keldon Warlords and a card that gives them lifelink and trample. Like, it's insane. And they were like, "No, I don't see it." And then like you play it out with them, and they're like, "Geez, that's not okay."
Yeah, it doesn't seem powerful as it's happening, but then all of a sudden you just slowly feel the game is being lost, and you're like, "What?
Yeah.
What happened?" It was one Urza Saga. Like, I don't get it, and it was like the game's gone now because you didn't deal with it.
Yeah. And you reckon that's one of a valuable lesson to be had there as a control player. The cards that you have problems with, when you get to play with them yourselves and actually see how they operate, and then you also can recognize if there's a weak spot, you'll be able to identify where the weak spot is as the pilot, and then when you're on the other side of the table, be able to go, "Oh, I recognize this pattern. That's the weak spot. That's where I need to time my interaction," or whatever it may be.
Yep.
There was one point where I saw there was a recent game that I saw where a Jeskai control player. I know he was playing staff. I don't know the rest of the list, though. But he was going up against a red painter player. And he's grinding. The stuff is going fine. The red painter player has exactly Urza Saga and Ancient Tomb. The Urza Saga is on 2. He spends his Ancient Tomb to cast a painter and passes the turn. And the Jeskai player did not recognize that represented a kill.
Yeah.
Because the Urza Saga can float the mana, tutor up the grindstone, saving the mana because it's already in play, and then tapping the Ancient Tomb that's 3 mana to activate the grindstone and kill them. And they didn't recognize that Urza Saga was essentially 2 mana in that line when they untapped. And that was a big deal.
A feint within a feint, really, yeah.
They were able to do that even without a land drop. But it's also like once you know that, like once you recognize that Urza Saga Soul Land Painter is a kill, then you know I'm not going to run it. I'm not going to fall for the kill, right? Like, and you can, and it's like you were saying, you can position yourself, but you need to recognize like, not like once you, it's like in chess, right? You know exactly how to checkmate with a rook and a queen against the king. Like, here's the easiest way to do it. Same thing, Ancient Tomb, Urza Saga Painter, that's a kill. Yeah. Recognize it.
Yeah, I think just recognizing too, just all the different. There's every threat now. The power creep is very subtle, if that makes any sense. Like, initiative doesn't happen in one turn. Urza Saga, it doesn't happen in one turn. It's not like before where I cast Show and Tell. Here's my Grizzlebrand. Here's my Emrakul. It's like I can quickly identify. It feels like the power creep is this. You have to have card knowledge. You have to have a little bit of matchup knowledge and understand what is their end goal. Because if you don't fight over the right things now, it's the game eventually gets to the point where you can't come back.
Yeah, you're kind of offered a chance to like choose the right path, and if you choose the wrong path, it's over. Yeah, but if you do make, and this comes all the way back down to deck building, but if you make the right decision when that crux happens, you have a chance at least.
Yeah. And before too, I'd say when I left, sometimes I think more so now you have to play 3 turns ahead comparatively to before. Whereas before, sometimes my deck would just carry me. Sometimes it's like, oh, hidden treat, we're cool, I'm stable, we're done. Like, I don't hit terminus, reset, you don't have any more resources, we're good. My deck.
You're saying poetry right now, man.
Yeah.
Hitting a tree, miracling. I can feel the dopamine right now.
Yeah, I would just be like, ooh. It's like it's miracle, and that rush of joy you got knowing you're just like, you just put so much effort to just have everything go to the bottom of your deck, or here's my angels, that Delver isn't so scary anymore. And it was such a, your deck would carry you so much more, I feel like, before, whereas now I feel like control, it just has you have, I mean, this has always been control, is having, you have all the answers but no questions. And now you're trying to okay, I have to put out my own question at some point here, but I have to do it in a mindful way, because if I tap down at the wrong time, the opponent's deck sequence starts, and if I can't immediately answer it with backup to defend my answer, the game's gone. It's just, you can't do anything. So I think it's such an exciting time in Magic for me, because you have to start planning ahead. You have to start identifying different things, because before too, if it feels semi-stale after a while, I've felt that way, where I'm like, okay, well, I know this deck and I know I have to answer this, but now there's so many threats out there and so many different things, and you can't fight against it all. It's just such an exciting time to be playing Control, in my opinion, or any deck really, like, because even if you're a combo player and you're sitting there, there's so much different. I can't even. It was a Lavinia or Lavinia. Like,
Lavinia.
there's so many,
Lavinia?
like, Lavinia, yeah, the blue white creature.
The
I'm
legend,
looking at all this hate sideboard stuff that, like, there's so much unique hate too for decks that are out there now. It's awesome. So I think it's an exciting time to be in Magic.
I think one of the cool things is, I used to, you'd hit like week 2 of a set being out, and you were like, okay, the legacy cards have been, positioned into the decks that they want to be positioned into. Now it's another 2.5 months till a set comes out. Now it's like, I still look forward to a set coming out, but there's so much to explore still. Months after a set comes out, whereas I felt like before, because things are pushed, that's a little bit of a part of it. But I don't feel like, I don't feel the format being as stale as it used to feel every now and again. I'd be like, well, I've got the 56 cards in my Rug Delver list that I'm playing, and then, depending on the meta, these 6 slots, and then it quickly became like, okay, like, every time a set comes out, I have to look and see, like, what are some things that I can test, and you only have 12 weeks between sets, basically, so you have to spend those slots. You basically have a limited amount of slots that you can mess around with for an entire couple weeks worth of tournaments before you're like, okay, this is what I'm on. Here's a big event coming up, and this is what I'm going to play.
Yeah, and as new players getting into Legacy, it's an investment up front. But every time I've bought into Legacy and you sat on my cards down the road, it's always seems like if you ever got out, your money was always increased. But beyond that, there's so many good resources out there. You can go to Kinko's and for $8, $7, print up your deck on, or like 5-10 decks that you're interested in, and sit there and just with your friends sleeve them up, put them in, get a bunch of basic lands, slide them into some sleeves, and just play the decks and see how they feel. That's like, if you're looking to get into the format, I think and I'm sure there's an online option that's better that I'm unaware of. But for me, I like paper. I like sitting down across from my friends. So I find that, proxying up your decks for, $30-$40, the ones you're interested in, is such a strong investment.
Yeah. I have a resource that I used for a long time that you reminded me of. I haven't used it in a while because of the pandemic and everything. But prior to lockdowns, I used this all the time with one of my good friends, Jared, who we expect to have on the cast in the next couple of weeks. Like you, I also prefer having the cards in my hand. Like, I like the dexterity of having the cards in my hand. I feel like I learn better when I have the cards in my hand than when I'm playing online. Like, I still make mistakes in paper, even if I've practiced it online, because I'm just not physically used to how I'm supposed to do the things. And one of the very useful tools for me was a website called metadeck.me. And that is, essentially you get to import a bunch of different deck lists, and then it will print you a column.
Oh, yeah.
Not a column,
that's right.
It'll print you like 12 rows where each row can represent a card in a different deck list. So if you're like, I want to try, 4 different versions of Jeskai and 3 different versions of 4-color and Yorion control, what you can do is you can actually set a deck to each row. And so your card will show 12 rows, each with a different card in each row, a named card in each row. But then
you're playing deck 3 this
I'm going to play deck 3, and that's Jeskai with all the walkers, and deck 4 is Jeskai staff or whatever. The limiting factor is you have to know what all the cards do, because it only says the name. So if that's not your bottleneck, if your bottleneck is learning play patterns and learning how to actually pilot a deck, which is where I was and my buddy Jared was when we would play test. We knew what all the cards did. It was just a matter of figuring out what are the best ones and how do we operate them together. Metadeck.me is actually a resource that I highly recommend to people too.
That's also great because then you just print 2 decks and you have a gauntlet.
That's what I mean. Yeah. So when we would essentially decipher a metagame and we would pick the decks that we knew we wanted to play or some versions of the ones that we wanted to play. And then we would print the 6 top decks we expected the field to be, like the likeliest that we were going to run into, that we felt we needed to be prepared for. And then one of us would just play one of the gauntlet decks, even if we knew we weren't going to be piloting them. And then we would just practice that way, going back and forth. And
that's just a good way to get better at the game, period.
And if honestly, you want to talk about tournament prep, that is one of the best things you can do, is not just playing your deck, is play the other decks that you're going against and feel the flow of the deck. Like start to see like, okay, well, these are some pinch points that they don't have a lot of 3-drops. So if I fight them over turns 1 and 2, like I'm not worried about some scary 3 or 4 drop. I know where to fight the deck, learning how to play the other decks, don't even have to play it well, just playing a couple games with them. That'll get you so much better at your deck. I can't even describe the value that gives you.
Yeah. The value that I remember taking when I would pilot the other decks again, like we wouldn't even necessarily finish the games. We would just get to critical points. We would get to the critical junctures, and then we would play it. We knew that was the critical juncture, and then we would just pull it back and analyze that positional thing and be like, had you done it this way, this would have been the outcome, and that would have been more favorable. And we would just try and assess those patterns. That was really where the play testing on those things were really valuable, because we didn't spend hours upon hours upon hours of just playing games. We would play the games to the critical points and then discuss the critical points. It's like when you play against Storm, that when the Storm pilot, when the pilot could go for it, when they were going for it, what were the minimum number of resources that they needed in order to break through X amount of interaction. And so if you're playing the control deck, if the game is developing and you go, okay, they have access to X amount of mana, this is implying to me that I need X amount of pieces of interaction. Otherwise, they're going to be able to break through. Granted, this was back when you could pass in flames through a force of will, but that sort of thing was valuable, because then that the control player know, how do I assess my cantrips? I have 2 pieces of interaction. They can beat 3. I am extremely far behind in this game, even though nothing is happening on board. Knowing that kind of value, that value as a game progresses, it's stuff from that kind of play testing. So yeah, I think that's an essential piece of learning a format as well, is learning those decks. And then you also recognize when you play those decks where you feel soft, like when you pilot elves, you're like, oh man, when they hit the wire with symbiote, I feel really naked. I'm kind of just a dopey shitter deck without wire with symbiote,
Whereas if you're on the other side and you're like, wow, I only hit the symbiote.
It's like, There's one of the things that I learned playing against green-white depths. I was doing something similar while I was practicing against that deck because it was really popular. This was before it sort of fell off. I don't know why it fell off, but it sort of did. But back when it was winning a bunch of tournaments because it had a really good Delver matchup, I remember where anytime my opponent represented a Green Sun Zenith for 1, I had to fight over it because it was represented Sylvan Safekeeper.
Oh
no! In that deck, it represented Sylvan Safekeeper, and if you didn't keep in all of your board sweepers, that implied whether or not you're supposed to fight over the Green Sun Zenith, because either you left in your board sweepers because you were consciously like, I need to be able to beat Sylvan Safekeeper, or if you boarded out your depending on how you wanted your board plan to be, if you boarded out your sweepers, then you were like, okay, well now I just have to use all my counter magic to fight over the Green Sun Zeniths, and that changed how you. That changed your sideboard plan when you knew those critical points when you play the matchup, and that comes from testing,
Yeah. Also, just having multiple brains around, sitting down and just this is this matchup, and this is how I think I would board. What do you guys think? And just being able to sit there and not have to guess. And so you're like, okay, I'm against this matchup. I saw this, and this. I know how to board. You're not sitting there guessing like, do I take this out? Do I take this? And you're middle of a big tournament, 8 rounds, 9 rounds, whatever it is. The less tax you can put on yourself of having to think about that stuff, the better you're going to do, the better decisions you're going to make. So over the course
that kind of preparation, I can't overstate that kind of preparation, but that's where the, can I get a sideboard guide? How do you sideboard? Like the shallowness of that is still going to leave a lot of gaps in your play because
Mm-hmm.
it's like you were talking about before with the book analogy. Not only do you need to know how to sideboard, the sideboard needs to represent something in game to you when you're doing it. Like
Mm-hmm.
if I showed you how I boarded against green white depths, and then you didn't know that was with the thought in mind that you are going to use your counter magic on Green Sun Zenith. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you don't know that and they resolve Green Sun Zenith and then you get bodied and you're like, I don't know what's going on. I boarded exactly like I thought I was supposed to. And
this is an unwinnable matchup.
Yeah,
You know,
it's like
that's where that stuff comes in.
Yeah.
And it's like if you did, it's like those types of things when you look at sideboard guides or ask somebody like, how do you board? It's like you need to know how somebody boards, and then also what are then the critical things that they care about in the matchup.
Mm-hmm.
That if they don't think that something out of their board can be helpful with, like, yeah, I don't feel like I ever needed Terminus because they can win at instant speed, and if I can't set up the Terminus at instant speed, none of it matters. So I find that positionally that's bad for me, but I do have answers to Green Sun Zenith main board. I can use my counter magic to fight over that. And so I can devote my sideboard slots to the other problematic things in the deck based on what I've seen over like looking at the list for that given metagame. But, you know, your sideboard isn't going to solve all of the problems. It will solve some of the problems that your main deck otherwise can't. And so being able to isolate those problems and then address that in sideboarding, there's value there, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, we're running like very low on time. But Aaron, I want to thank you for coming on, and we definitely want to have you back as you kind of as your journey continues through Legacy and see how that progresses.
Yeah, I'd love it. No, thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for
I have
sure.
One last question now with the SCG Baltimore. There's a couple of 5Ks, a 10K, a lot of Legacy action happening this weekend. 2 questions. If you were going to SCG Baltimore to play in a 10K, what deck would you play? What version of a deck would you play right now? And 2, if you were to go into... So the fun thing about this weekend is Lord of the Rings comes out at the same time and will be legal.
Yeah.
So everybody will be playing. Like if card availability for the first time in a long time that I can remember may be an issue. The One Ring is legal. Orcish Bowmasters is legal. All this stuff will be legal this
Thoron's
weekend.
Ransom is legal.
If you can get your hands on it.
Yeah.
So would you change your preparation under these circumstances, not knowing if people will actually have the cards to play the lists that they'd like to play with a new set?
I think 100% I would not change my list. I would play the deck that I'm comfortable with. I would like to test stuff. If I was sitting there and I was able to test it, like proxied with friends and stuff, sure, I would consider him like, okay, this does work. But knowing that a lot of the people aren't going to have access to the cards, it's so new. Many of the people pre-ordered it online and they'll be waiting for it to ship to them. It won't be even available to them at the tournament. I would just play what I'm good at, what I'm comfortable with, because especially in big tournaments, you know, some people will get. I used to be this way when I first got into it. I'm like, well, this Grixis Delver is really strong, and I'm on Death and Taxes, and then I was like, but I like Sultai, so and like I kept like power hopping everywhere, and then I was mediocre at everything I played. Legacy is such a format of like you can be a one-trick pony and beat all your bad matchups if you know how to navigate the bad matchups. That is so much more valuable than having a new tech.
Yeah.
To me. So if you're comfortable, I personally, I wouldn't switch. I would stay on what I knew and what I'd been practicing. And if I did have to test anything, it would be Orcish Bowmaster or Delighted Halfling. So cool. So yeah, if I were to test, it'd be one of those, but it would only be something that I knew directly how to implement it into my strategy. So I know Orcish is good. So yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, that does it for us today. If you found value here, thank you for liking and subscribing, all that stuff. Help the algorithm out. And that does it for us this week. Aaron, thanks so much, man.
Thank you, guys.
It won't be the same, so come on down. Ride, call me.